Joining me now is New Jersey Democratic Senator Bob Menendez. He is, of course, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and a member of the Banking and Finance Committee. Senator, thank you so much for your time. Lots to discuss here as we see this. I want to start with you today on the Senate floor, urging the Biden administration to hold Russian President Vladimir Putin accountable for a litany of actions. You recommended imposing new sanctions, not extending expiring visas for Russian diplomats, calling out Russia's increased aggression in cyberspace and its illegal annexation of Crimea. Is it possible for President Biden to assert a more aggressive relationship with Vladimir Putin in one meeting, or do you think the administration needs a longer-term course correction here?
Well, I think it will take more than one meeting, but we set the tone with this meeting. I hope that the president will set the tone with this meeting. The reality is I just finished meeting a few minutes ago with Alexei Navalny's representative here who is visiting in Washington. And the one point that he made is the point I made in my speech, which is that every time that President Putin sees an overture, a reset, let's build a new bridge, he sees it as a sign of weakness. And that the only thing that he really appreciates and understands is strength. And so therefore, we already have a history. I understand President Biden's desire to have a predictable and stable relationship. That is desirable. It's desirable with every place in the world. But a predictable and stable relationship with President Putin has to start off with understanding that it's not predictable and stable when you use chemical weapons to kill your opponents. It's not predictable and stable when you go into a country and take over part of its territory in violation of international law. It's not predictable and stable when you have mass arrests of individuals who just simply are peacefully protesting for a change in their country. So this is what we have to realize in the history that we have. And so we start from there. If we start from there, then, and if we send strength as a message, then I think we can change the course.
So speaking of Alexei Navalny, as you just mentioned there, you noted that a congressional deadline has actually passed to impose new sanctions on Putin. Do you think the White House will ultimately impose these sanctions for what they have done to Alexei Navalny?
I believe they will. I believe the law calls for it, not discretion, but calls for it. I think the president may have withheld prior to his visit with Putin to use it as part of his message to Putin. But I believe that it will take place. It's part of the law in terms of chemical weapons attacks and consequences when the perpetrator is determined as to who it is, that those sanctions take place. I believe it will happen.
Is there a way for the U.S. Congress, to codify the American-European relationship in a way that it is not vulnerable to another President Trump that has frayed, by European assessment, the relationship, the transatlantic relationship? What should be done to make sure that that alliance is not vulnerable to another America-first leader in the future?
Well, that's a great question, and we've been thinking about it. The one thing we believe we can do to send an absolute guarantee is that for any president to withdraw from NATO, you would have to get a vote of Congress. Congress voted to enter the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as a treaty. It voted for that. If any president would want to withdraw from NATO, it should take Congress's act as well. I think that would be an incredible reassurance to the Europeans. And then, of course, we need to continue to build upon other elements of our transatlantic alliance. And we're doing that in a parliamentary way. I have been joining with my counterparts in Great Britain and other parts of Europe in a way that we haven't seen in years to build that foundation.
Let me stay on Europe just for one more question before we transition to a few other topics. Today, you met with Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who obviously has, given what has happened in Belarus with the forced downing of that plane-carrying dissident and journalist Roman Protasevich, has really ignited a debate about what the United States should be doing in a situation like this. How does the U.S. respond to affronts to the rule of law in a place like Belarus with the grounding of this plane without becoming the world police? What response do you think is appropriate and necessary here?
Well, Lukashenko and those who surround him clearly, as in the case of Putin, They have their oligarchs. They have their cronies. We can get access to their money. We can have visa denials. We can work with the European Union in strongly acting against Lukashenko. And we should. It should be a coordinated process. But, you know, it's not about being the world policeman, but it is upholding the rule of law. It is upholding international norms. It is about ultimately, if you say, as the Biden administration has said, that we are going to promote human rights and democracy as a pillar of our foreign policy, well, these are the ultimate affronts to human rights and democracy. What's happening to journalists inside Belarus is appalling.
Yeah.
We've had not only the main opponent to the regime, but we also had Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty with us today at the hearing. And what their journalists are going through is unacceptable. We have to send a clear message that, in fact, there are consequences for that.
Speaking of human rights, let's turn to the Middle East for a moment, because the U.S. and obviously the UN, and this administration specifically, they have spoken out forcefully against the forced expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem, and they want to prevent those evictions. What would you do? What should this administration do to prevent the eviction of Palestinians from their homes there in East Jerusalem? Would you, as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, be prepared to condition aid to Israel on its compliance with both U.S. and international human rights law?
Well, we're going to have, I think, a new administration in Israel, it seems from all accounts. And the first thing we should be doing is entering into a direct conversation with them about this particular issue and how this new administration intends to pursue the forced eviction of the Palestinian citizens who are living in East Jerusalem. I think that's the beginning of a conversation. I'm generally not for conditioning our assistance to the state of Israel, but I also believe that you can have robust diplomacy to have them understand how important this issue is, and that, in fact, they would be well served both for peace, stability, as well as the rights of Palestinians living within Israel to be afforded the same rights as any other Israeli citizen.
And finally, Chair Menendez, let me ask you just about China. The theory that COVID-19 may have been born out of a lab leak has gotten a lot of mainstream traction, as you know. How should the U.S. respond if that theory does turn out to be true? And what if the intelligence review requested by the Biden administration finds that China concealed details about the lab leak?
Well, first of all, we have to determine, was the lab leak something that was done because they intended to use it for some type of biological warfare? Secondly, was it accidental? There's a fundamental difference in how that takes place. And then thirdly, if it concealed it, then, for example, at the World Health Organization, we have to question that China's ability to influence the World Health Organization when it lies to the world, if that's what took place. And so I think there have to be consequences in multilateral forums where China is positioned, obviously is degraded as a result of those actions, if that's what we find to be. And then we have to think about what other actions we would take against China under Xi Jinping as a result of the consequences of the loss of so many lives across the world, if the information turns out being what some suspect it to be.
All right, Senator Bob Menendez, greatly appreciate your time, sir. Thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Good to be with you.